are 3 handouts, lots of pages. I apologize for that.
But they're all
Yeah, I need to take, each one is stapled and they're numbered. So here's the 2, the 3, and here are the 1s. Okay. So 3 handouts. Because it's a lot of text, I printed relatively small. I hope you don't suffer from that too much. The 3rd handout, I imagine, will be the one we'll use most, number 3. This is the translations of the text that we'll be reading together, or at least some of them. Number 2 is the original, most of the original sources. And number 1 is the list of sources that I'm using, and a supplement of sources that are not in, of original sources that are not in number 2. Yeah, sure. I don't, do I need a mic, or is it recording? Is it okay? Okay, did the texts go around? Okay, so first of all, thanks to Guy and Sabine. It's great to be back among many of you who we were with together at Princeton last year, and to be joined by new faces as well. Following Marin's lecture, it occurred to me that what we're doing here is all about genre, and genre in a sense could be phrased differently as kind of the impact of form on content and reception of ideas. So when we were originally asked by Guy and Sabine to prepare our talks, we were told that it would be a kind of workshop format where we would read text together, we'd present a question or a thesis and examine it in the light of texts. So that's what I did. We will mostly be reading texts together. Unfortunately, I think this physical genre of a setting in which we're meeting together, I think, might make things a little difficult. It would have been better to be sitting around a table, but I understand that there are constraints that are not dependent on us. So I do want to spend most of our time reading texts together. So I'm saying following Marin's lecture because mine will not be a lecture, okay? We will mostly be reading texts, and I will elicit your help in the kind of a question that I will pose about these texts. I'm not sure we'll get through all of them, so don't be horrified or alarmed by the length of the handouts. So over the last few months, I've been working on a project which I'm tentatively entitling The Impact of the Holy Land on Christian Literary Production. And this project was basically kind of instigated initially by one major instigator and then 2 follow-up instigators. So the first instigator was an invitation by Aurélie Mo, Hillel Newman, and Yossi Patrich, who are editing a volume on Byzantine Palestine. And they asked me to write a chapter about Christian literature in Byzantine Palestine. So as I started going through the material and thinking about how to organize it and how to present it, as one does in these kinds of situations, I thought that I detected a pattern in some of the texts that I was working on, that I was collecting, a pattern that I hadn't noticed anybody, any other scholar, any other discussion really observing as such. Okay, there was something about many of the texts, not all the texts, but several of the texts produced in the Holy Land, and this is the theme of my chapter. There's something about many of the texts produced in the Holy Land, Christian texts per se, from the 3rd or 4th century through the 6th century, one could say, in different genres, there was a pattern that repeated itself. And I will reveal soon what this pattern is, and we will talk about this pattern and discuss whether my realization is in fact correct, and even if it's correct, whether it's helpful. That's what I'm going to kind of elicit your help with. So that's the main instigator, and I'm writing that chapter and working on it as I go. The other instigator was this workshop. Because, as you'll see, the kind of common denominator that I found or thought I found had to do with form, presentation of the texts, not genre in the sense that's usually, as it's usually defined when one discusses literary production or even Christian literary production, but a kind of different way of looking at the texts. This led me kind of to query the history, the genealogy of how patristic texts are described, how they are classified according to genres. And I won't go into this whole kind of history of scholarship question, which has a very, as is often the case with history of scholarship, is interesting in and of itself. I think we're all familiar with this term patrologies, right? These handbooks of patristic literature. And patrologies have been written for centuries. One could say, even Eusebius and Jerome wrote patrologies in the sense that they wrote histories of Christian literature, descriptions of Christian literature. But the use of the word patrology dates at least back to the 17th century. But it's only in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, and I think I've identified the point where this begins, where in patrologies we have the division into genres of patristic literature in the way that we are very familiar with them for anybody who's ever opened a patrology, right? If we're thinking of Quaston's famous patrology and many others, you open it up, you open to the author, it's divided by geographical areas, then subdivided into authors, and then within each author you will have a subdivision or further subdivision into genres, into types of patristic writing. And the types, the groupings, are things like apologetics, dogmatics, exegetical works, letters, sometimes ascetic works, something like that. Maybe a few other categories sometimes, depending on the author. This division is highly problematic and unhelpful from a historical point of view, and is not found in the text itself. There's no indication that the authors are thinking in terms of these genres. And it kind of led me to a realization that, okay, that's another interesting project, which I'm also working on, but that this whole question of kind of how we classify, how we typify, break down patristic literature needs to be rethought and redone in other, I think, more helpful ways. That's the second instigator. The third instigator is coming up. This is Marin's conference in a couple weeks. In her, what? A couple? Yeah, a couple is vague enough to be 2, 3. Towards the end of the month, where Marin's group has been about the self or the subject in antiquity. And I will be using some of the ideas that I think I'm coming towards in this project to present some of the things there and also kind of get the feedback from the people there. So having begun with that long introduction, I want to get to the heart of the pattern I think I see. The pattern is that in several different areas, several different types of patristic writing, patristic I mean just ancient Christian writing, we have in Palestine, in the Holy Land, we have on the one hand a continuation of many of the ways of writing about patristic, or ways of writing Christian literature that we find in other parts of the Christian world. Okay, so we have, a commentary will be written in Palestine for centuries, just like it's written anywhere else, and it doesn't look essentially different. And this is true of homilies, of different types of Christian writing. But alongside that, there are three areas where we have an innovation, a literary innovation, that scholars have attributed to Palestine. Meaning that the literary innovation happens in Palestine at different periods in different areas. I'll tell you in a moment what they are. But according to scholarship at least, they're all happening in Palestine. And what I want to ask is, first of all, is this true? That it's happening in Palestine? Second of all, if it is true, why? Why? What is it about this area that produces this innovation that I'm about to tell you? Okay, so the three areas are historiography, what one could call biblical scholarship or biblical commentary, and hagiography or ascetic writing. What is the common denominator between these three areas? What new thing develops and is said by scholarship to happen in Palestine? Now, drum roll. I'm going to tell you what this thing is. What we find in these three areas is we find a innovation having to do with a shift from a individualistic author persona to a collective author persona. Now, when I say author persona, I mean the voice that's producing the work will be speaking, and either by quotation or by usage, but it will always be explicit, right? It will be speaking in many different voices. Okay, so the first example that comes to mind is Eusebius. Right? Much has been made of Eusebius's innovation, definitely in Christian historiography. Some would argue even in Greco-Roman historiography in general, that his...
Can you just point who these anonymous scholars are?
What? Who says...
For example, the innovation of Eusebius in historiography.
Oh, much... there's...
Who are you referring to? Who are your others?
Yeah, beginning... I mean, Doron Mendels has written about this, and Harry Attridge has written about this, and Aryakovsky has written about this, and to some degree you find it already. I mean, it goes back to earlier patristic scholarship in the 20th century. Yeah. And the realization here is that Eusebius is quoting sources, embedding sources in his historiography as part of the story, right? And that's how we can tell our Christian history, because Eusebius quotes his sources by name and makes it the front and center part of the story, right? As opposed, for example, and I know that Marin has written, for example, of Eusebius's use of Philo versus Clement's use of Philo, right? So when Clement uses Philo, he almost never, he sometimes, but very, very rarely, says, I am using Philo, right? Eusebius, both in his historiography, by the way, and also in non-historiographical works, but especially in the historiography, the whole historiography is founded on saying, I am using sources. Here's what this says, here's what this says, here's what this says, and he goes through the centuries and explains, builds his whole narrative on quotations from, explicit quotations from earlier sources. Okay, so I'm calling this a collective model of authorship in the sense that he's saying, I'm going to tell my story through a polyphony of voices. Okay? Now this might seem kind of obvious. In some way, this is how we write historiography to this day, in the usage of footnotes. Right? But in the Greco-Roman world, this was not usually how historiography was done. Okay? Usually, there were sources, there were always sources. Everybody's using sources all the time, but the question is how explicit it is. Okay, that's Eusebius, and Eusebius is not going to be the focus of my discussion because a lot has been written on Eusebius. Please. Yeah.
Does he point to contradictory sources? Or do they all support his narrative?
No, they will. I mean, he doesn't always agree with all this. He doesn't always agree with all the. again, the sources he's using are not necessarily, this happened because so-and-so says it. But it'll often be, I am telling you the story through, right? I'm going to tell you about the Easter controversy by quoting the documents involved and telling you exactly what I'm quoting. Okay?
It doesn't have two different sources and then explain why.
I don't remember cases like that. That's a good question. Okay? Now I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about biblical quotations, that everybody does, but that's a different story because biblical quotations are quoted by everybody, right? As a divine authority, right? We're talking about usage of predecessors within your line of writing that produce your narrative, right? Okay, so that's one area where we find this. And of course, Eusebius is in Palestine, right, in Caesarea. The other area where we find this phenomenon is biblical scholarship or commentary. And what I'm thinking of here is the Catenae.
Not Origen?
No. So Origen will not, in Origen, so you could bring in the Hexapla as an interesting example for this, but let's start with the more obvious example. The more obvious example is the Catenae. What are the Catenae? The Catenae are, instead of sitting down and writing a biblical commentary, what the authors, usually anonymous but not always, of Catenae do is they say, we have verse X, and I'm going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different earlier patristic authorities who said that made a comment on this passage. Okay? And the way it's presented is as a juxtaposition of all the different opinions about this passage. Okay? Again, what I think of as a collective model of authorship. Since Marin raised the question of Origen, it could be claimed that Origen also fits within this in the Hexapla. The whole point of the Hexapla is giving different versions of the Bible. And what you're doing is presenting, again, a polyphony of voices. Right? I think it's a little more complicated, that case, so I'm going to leave it to the side. But normally, the important point here is that it only happens in the Catenae because when Origen is writing a biblical commentary, he's usually not going to found his commentary on earlier commentaries. Okay? That's the second example. And the third example is ascetic writings. Oh, and just before we move on to the third example, in the second example, scholars say that this too began in Palestine in the either late 5th or early 6th century.
So who are these scholars?
Who are these scholars? So Harl, Marguerite Harl, who published a text that we're about to read. This is the so-called Palestinian Catenae on Psalm 118. Gilles Dorival, who wrote a 5-volume study on the Catenae on Psalms. And who's the third author I'm thinking of? Oh yeah, and of course Françoise Petit, who has probably done more than anybody else, any other single scholar, in terms of publishing Catenae both on the Old and the New Testaments, the Greek Catenae, and she also argues that this was of Palestinian provenance. And in general, everybody, Robert de Vries, who wrote a very long, important article on the Greek Catenae, also claims it's a Palestinian origin. And our third category is ascetic writings. And this is what we're going to delve into in a moment. In ascetic writings, the kind of maybe first hagiographical text, the most famous hagiographical text, what would it be? The first life of a ascetic saint.
Anthony.
Yeah, life of Anthony.
It's Egypt, no? Isn't it from Egypt?
It is from Egypt.
So why do you...
Let me finish my sentence. So the life of Anthony, right, written by Athanasius in the 360s probably, is presented as a story that Athanasius is telling. It is not a collective model, right? Ascetic texts about ascetic saints were written in this mode until, again, the late 5th, early 6th century, when we have a new phenomenon that scholars connect to Palestine of writing ascetic texts as collections of sayings, right? Where instead of telling a story like Athanasius does, the apophthegmata patrum, right? The sayings of the fathers, right? Where instead of telling hagiography, telling a story of a saint's life, what we find is collections of sayings of fathers. Again, a collective mode of authorship, of presentation, of authorial persona. I'm not sure exactly what to call it. Some of these cases are there's a clear and stated author function, right? Eusebius in the case of an individual author, right? A known author, Eusebius in the case of historiography. In other cases, like with the apophthegmata, it's anonymous. Right? We don't know who's putting these texts together, right? But the very act of putting them together implies some kind of authorial function. This too is connected by scholars, and now to preempt Marin's question, I will tell you which scholars. Basically, the people who have worked on the Catenae. René de Draguet published a text that we will read soon, which is one of the earliest. He thinks is the kind of the source of the apophthegmata. This is a non-anonymous text. This is written or attributed to a certain ascetic in mid-5th century Gaza, Abba Isaiah of Skedis. So he and almost everybody, any handbook you open about the literature of the fathers of the desert will repeat this thing, that the apophthegmata patrum, this whole idea of collecting these sources of sayings of the fathers, originated in Palestine, probably some people say probably in Gaza. Okay, so it looks like a pattern. Okay, what I want to do with you is read the texts and see if this pattern even matters. Does it matter? What difference does it make when you're presenting a story, when you're presenting a figure, when you're writing a biblical commentary? What difference does it make whether it's this individual mode of authorship or this collective mode of authorship? Does it make any difference? And I'm seriously asking you to help me answer this question, and I'm very much open to the answer being no, it doesn't make a difference. Okay, so we're going to look at some texts and ask that question. That's one thing we're going to ask. And then we're going to ask, why Palestine? What could it be? Well, maybe. What is it about Palestine that is moving Christians in Palestine to move to this collective model? And then I'll share with you, as you've probably noticed in my presentation, I've been saying scholars say this. It could be that there's a fallacy here. It could be that it's not even true. So we'll talk about that at the end. Remind me if we don't get to it. Before we jump into the texts, let me just see if there's anything else. No, I think we can jump into the text, but let me first ask you if you have any questions about what I've said so far.
Just with regards to your first case of Eusebius, it seems to be a kind of a middle case in which you have, even though you have some kind of polyphony, it is still tied to a single author which utilizes many voices in order to maintain a unitary story.
Very good. Yes, I wholeheartedly agree. And that too, I'm going to ask if that makes a difference. We will see in the case of Abba Isaiah, which is a text that might be similar, an ascetic text, where you have an individual author who is also presenting his narrative through a bunch of different voices. So maybe parallel to Eusebius, maybe not. And that too, I'll want to hear from you if you think that makes a difference. Okay, so yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah, excellent, yeah. Sorry, yeah. So I'm glad you asked that. I'd say a difference in terms of the content, in terms of the rhetorical impact of the text, how the text accomplishes or seems to our reconstruction seems to be trying to accomplish maybe something different. What effect the text has on the reader, on the audience, right? If there's logic in this shift, why I would present like this versus like this, how does it, what kind of difference does it make in terms of the content and in terms of the rhetorical effect on the audience? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a question that probably doesn't relate to the text themselves, which is why I'm asking it now.
Great.
It relates to what happens later after the Islamic conquest and the all-important question of when do people lose the authorial I or the name, or when do we have what we call a book, and who is responsible for that? Is it the Muslim sources or the Christian sources? Which is why for me it's important to keep the authorial I as you present it, and I wonder why you avoid using a mitigated form of the word anthology.
Okay, so two questions. So the first question, the simple answer is that prior to these innovations that might be happening in the Holy Land, the norm is a very strong authorial I. Normally, Christian texts speak with a strong authorial I, not always identified within the text, right? Usually not. It's by attribution, but there's definitely an authorial I who will say things like a preface and lead you through the text and refer to different parts within the text, sometimes talking about their own biographical background. Okay, so that is basically the norm within Christian literature. This phenomenon, I think, is the exception. So most of the texts that we will read will be texts with what I think is actually a strong authorial I, because I want to read both sides of what makes a difference. So we'll read ones with an authorial I, and we'll read ones where either there's an authorial I, but there's also a collective of voices that the authorial I is using, or there's no clear authorial I, and it's just a concatenation of voices. Now, regarding your second question, anthology, anthology definitely works where there is no authorial I. You could say that also works in cases where there's... I have nothing against the word anthology. I like collective because it enables me to set up this binary, if indeed it exists, between collective and individualistic.
I'm particularly concerned about the ascetic literature, because the same kind of literature, in Sufi literature, we would use the word anthology, even if we know who collected it.
Yeah, I'm very happy with using the word anthology. Anthology doesn't... What's the opposite of an anthology? That's what I would say. That synthetic. Okay, so yeah, we could call it synthetic versus anthological. But again, as you'll see in the case of Abba Isaiah, it could be called synthetic in the sense that he's doing work, or Eusebius, he's doing work with his sources, right? He's not just kind of presenting it all. And by the way, even in anthologies, I think there's a synthetic action going on. So maybe that's the answer to your question. Yeah.
Just a question, will you dedicate a discussion on the usage and the way how these texts were being read?
Later, or at the time?
When they were produced. I mean, I'm just, what is closer to me, I mean, if you take the sentences of Petrus Lombardus and take them as an anthology, you still only have half of the picture, because it was a text which was actually written in order to be read and studied together with students. So parts of the anthologies, for example, of the Apoptegmata, can well be part of a lecture course, which would probably not be true for Eusebius.
Excellent. So that is exactly the kind of what I was talking before about the impact it has on the audience, what kind of function it can serve in life, right? In reality and social settings. that would be one answer to the question, what difference does it make, right? I want to produce this kind of text for a certain social setting, educational setting, exactly. So, but we don't know what that is. Usually we have to reconstruct this based on what we think from the texts themselves. We have very little evidence from this period of how, right, texts talking about texts being used. Direct evidence, but it can be postulated or reconstructed. But that's exactly the kind of thing that I would be interested in hearing. Other questions? Are you ready to dig in? So there's a lot of text here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different columns. I don't think it would be wise to try to read it all. We are on 3. So now that, yeah, okay, so basically just to explain what you have before you. 3 is the text, all the texts in translation. The first 3 pages of this 4-page handout are the ascetic texts, okay, which comprise 5 individualistic model texts, the first 5, and 2 collective model texts, okay? I'm sorry if there are not quite enough handouts. I made 15, maybe that probably was not enough. So, what? Share? Okay, so the first 3 pages are ascetic texts, and the 4th page is biblical commentary, okay, where I give you 2 individualistic model and 1 collective model. Now, it's a challenge to figure out how to do this exercise because usually the different texts are not talking about the same thing. And in order to compare, you want to compare the same thing, right? By the way, this is 3, I said, as the translations, 2 is the originals, and handout number 1 is supplement of originals that did not fit into 2. Okay. So, or 2 is all the Greek texts, and 1 is the Syriac and Latin text. Okay. So what I decided to do is take, in the case of an ascetic text, focus on an individual ascetic upon which there is relatively limited amount of material, because otherwise this handout would be endless, right? So we're going to focus on an individual called Amun of Nitria, a 4th century Egyptian monastic saint. All we know about him, we know from what you're holding in your hands, right? So everything I'm telling you is just based on these sources that we're about to read. We have no other sources about this guy. And he was associated with the early kind of generation of 4th century ascetics like Anthony of Egypt. What you have before you is the 7 different presentations of this monk, beginning in the 4th century itself with the life of Anthony, where he makes a cameo appearance, and then 2 what might be called hagiographical texts from the early 5th century. That's History of the Monks in Egypt and Palladius. Then 2 historiographical texts from a little later in the 5th century. And then 2 collective model texts, Abba Isaiah, who operated in Gaza in the mid-5th century, and the Apophthegmata Patrum, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, which we don't know exactly when it is dated to or where it comes from, but it's thought, scholars again, say Palestine, late 5th, 6th century, partially because of this precedent of Abba Isaiah. Okay, so I don't think it would be wise to try to read them all, but we'll start with Anthony, the life of Anthony, probably by Athanasius, not Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, very famous bishop for the Nicene cause in the mid-4th century, probably the author of this Life of Anthony, which again, as I said, is considered kind of the foundational text of Christian hagiography. It features also in Augustine's Confessions, in an early stage of his conversion, where he was exposed to a Latin translation of this text. So we're going to read on the left side column. I know it's small writing, but can I have a volunteer, please? Yudi?
You're looking at me.
Well, you're looking at me.
Okay. Here's a lecture.
Okay, you want me to read all these texts?
But the marvel here was only in the case of Antony, that he sitting in the mountain had in his heart watchful, and had the Lord to show him things afar off. And this is so, for once again he was sitting on a mountain, and looking up, saw in the air someone being borne upwards, and there was much joy among those who met him. All to the end?
Yeah, 3 pages worth.
Then wondering and deeming a company of that kind to be good, he prayed to learn what this might be. And immediately the voice came to him. This is the soul of Amun, the monk at Nitya. Now, Amun had preserved in the discipline up to the old age, and the distance from Nitya to the mountain where Antony was 13 days' journey. The companions of Antony, therefore, seeing the old man amazed, asked to learn, and heard that Amun was just dead. And he was well known, for he had stayed there very often, and many signs had been wrought by his means. And this is one of them. Once, when he had need to cross the river, called Lycus, now it was seasons of the flood, he asked his comrade Theodorus to remain at a distance, that they should not see one another naked as they swam the water. Then, when Theodorus was departed, he again felt ashamed even to see himself naked. While therefore he was pondering, filled with shame, on a sudden he was borne over to the other side. Theodorus, therefore, himself being a good man, approached, and seeing Amun across, first without a drop of water falling from him, inquired how he had got over. And when he saw that Amun was unwilling to tell him, he held him by the feet, and declared that he would not let him go before he had learned it from him. So, Amun, seeing the determination of Theodorus, especially from what he had said, and having asked him to tell no man before his death, told him that he had been carried and placed on the further side, and that he had not even set foot on the water, nor was that possible for man, but for the Lord alone, and those whom he permits. And he did for the great apostle,
As he did for the
as he did for the great apostle Peter. Theodorus therefore told this after the death of Amun, and the monks to whom Antony spoke concerning Amun's death marked the day. And when the brethren came up from Nitya 30 days after, they inquired of them and learned that Amun was fallen asleep at that day and hour in which the old man had seen his soul borne upward. And both these and the other brothers marveled at the purity of Antony's soul, how he had immediately learned that which was taking place at a distance of 13 days' journey, and had seen the soul as it was taken up.
Okay, so this is, thank you, Yudi. This is one presentation of Amun in the life of Antony, our earliest source for this character. I think it would be right to summarize that we have 2 main elements here. One, the story of how this is the story that frames, that brackets the narrative, begins by the discussion of how Antony saw his soul being lifted upwards, meaning his time of death, and then ends with the description that this time of death happened exactly at the time when Amun died. So in this description, Amun and Antony never met each other, right? Do you agree that that's clear, right? Anthony had this clairvoyant vision of seeing Amun's soul rising up to heaven at his death, 13 days distance apart from him, but at the exact time it happened. That's one element, and the other element is this story embedded within the story with Theodore and the crossing of the river, how Amun was transported miraculously across the river without getting wet, and it stressed that Theodore only told this story once Amun was dead. Okay. Are we ready for another story about Amun? Ben, would you like to read us history of the monks in Egypt?
Former Carius, there was a Mysian monk called Amun, who saw Anthony saw born up to heaven. He was the first of the monks to settle in Nitria. He was of noble birth and had rich parents who forced him to marry against his will. When they had compelled him to do this, he persuaded the girl in the bridal chamber that they should post and preserve their virginity in secret. A few days later, he left for Nitria, while she, for her part, exhorted her servants to adopt a celibate life and indeed converted her house into a monastery. Now, when he was living as a solitary in Nitria, a child suffering from rabies was brought to him, bound with a chain, for a rabid dog had bitten him and given him the disease. His suffering was so unbearable, his whole body was convulsed by it. And when Amun saw the child's parents coming to receive him, he said, "Why are you troubling me, my friend, seeking something which is beyond my merits, when the remedy lies in your own hands? Give back to the widow the ox which you have killed surreptitiously, and your child will be restored to you in good health." Their crime having thus been exposed, they happily did what they had been told, and when the father prayed, the child instantly recovered. Another time, some people came to visit him, to test their inward dispositions. The saint said to them, "Bring me a storage jar that I may have an ample supply of water for the reception of visitors." They promised to bring him a jar, but when they came to the village, one of them changed his mind and said to the other, "I'm not going to kill my camel. She would die if I loaded a storage jar onto her." The other, when he heard this, yoked the asses together and with much labor transported the jar. Before he could speak, Amun said, "What has happened that your companion's camel has died while you have made your way here?" When the man returned, he found that the camel had been devoured by wolves. The saint did many other miracles in the sight of all. Once some of the monks were sent to him by Anthony to fetch him, for Anthony was in the further desert. When they were on their way back, they came to a branch of the Nile. The brothers suddenly saw Amun transported to the opposite bank, but they themselves crossed over by swimming. When they came to where Anthony was, he spoke first to Amun, saying, "God has revealed to me many things concerning you. He has manifested your departure from this life. I therefore felt compelled to summon you to me, that we might enjoy each other's company and intercede for each other." Then he set him to a spot some distance away, and ordered him not to leave it until he left his life. When he died all alone, Anthony saw his soul borne up to heaven by angels.
Okay, so this text bears some similarities to the life of Anthony, but also major differences. We have miracles that we did not see in the life of Anthony, right? The miracle with the child suffering from rabies, and the miracle with the camel and the donkeys, right? The camel who dies because the guy doesn't want to bring the water, and the clairvoyance associated with that. And then we have this other element that shows up already at the beginning of refusal to marry, or to consummate the marriage. What else? What else? Summoning the? Good. Okay. So Anthony summons Amun, right? And do they meet in this text? They do meet, right? Unlike the first text, where they don't meet. They meet, and basically Anthony summons him to tell him that he's about to die, and he dies, and he sees his soul go up to heaven. Okay, any comments about the two texts so far? Okay. I guess we'll skip Palladius, and we'll go to Socrates. Historian, probably a lawyer operating in Constantinople in the mid-5th century, writes a ecclesiastical history and says as follows. Anybody? Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
refer to the monasteries of Egypt, it may be proper here to give a brief account of them. They were founded probably at a very early period, but were greatly enlarged and augmented by a devout man whose name was Amun. In his youth, this person had an aversion to matrimony, but when some of his relatives urged him not to contend marriage, but to take a wife to himself, he was prevailed upon and was married. On leading the bride with the customary ceremonies from the banquet room to the nuptial couch, after their mutual friends had withdrawn, he took a book containing the epistles of the apostles and read to his wife Paul's epistle to the Corinthians. What else? Explaining the apostles' admonitions to married persons. Adducing many external considerations, besides, he descanted on the inconveniences and discomforts attending matrimonial intercourse, the pangs of childbearing, and the trouble and anxiety connected with rearing a family. He contrasted with all this the advantages of chastity, described the liberty and immaculate purity of a life of continence, and affirmed that virginity places persons in the nearest relation to the deity. But these and other arguments of a similar kind, he persuaded his virgin bride to renounce with him a secular life, prior to their having any conjugal knowledge of each other. Having taken this resolution, they retired together to the mountain of Nitria, and in a hut there inhabited for a short time one common ascetic apartment, without regarding their difference of sex, being according to the apostles one in Christ. But not long after, the recent and unpolluted bride thus addressed Amun, "It is unsuitable," said she, "for you who practice chastity, to look upon a woman in so confined a dwelling. Let us therefore, if it is agreeable to you, perform our exercise apart." This agreement again was satisfactory to both, and so they separated and spent the rest of their lives in abstinence from wine and oil, eating dry bread alone, sometimes passing over one day, at others fasting 2, and sometimes more. Athanasius, bishop of Alexandria, asserts in his Life of Anthony that the subject of his memoir, who was contemporary with this Amun, saw his soul taken up by angels after his decease. Accordingly, a great number of persons emulated Amun's manner of life, so that by degrees the mountains of Nitria and Cyprus were filled with monks, an account of whose lives would require an express work. As, however, there were among them persons of eminent piety, distinguished for their strict discipline and apostolic lives, who said and did many things worthy of being recorded, I deem it useful to interweave with my history a few particulars selected out of a great number for the information of my readers. It is said that Amun never saw himself naked, being accustomed to say that it became not a monk to see even his own person exposed. And when once he wanted to pass a river, but was unwilling to undress, he besought God to enable him to cross without his being obliged to break his resolution, and immediately an angel transported him to the other side of the river.
So, thoughts about this text? Does it seem to be corresponding or somehow relating to the other texts we saw so far?
Well, it quotes the life of Anthony.
It mentions the life of Anthony, exactly. What else?
Looks like he missed a good opportunity here to talk about the founding of the monastery of Amun's wife.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Missed an opportunity, meaning he
Well,
mentions it.
Talk about monasteries, that's the context. So here there was this known story, and he doesn't
Good.
include it.
Nice. Okay. And which wasn't mentioned in any of the earlier texts we saw. An
Well,
explicit.
in the second text.
The founding of a monastery?
Yeah. She converted her house into a monastery.
Ah, thank you. Okay.
No, but he adds the discussion between the two,
Yeah.
right?
The dramatization of
yeah,
the.
exactly, and the notion that she cannot be with him.
And that's the focus of the text, right? That occupies most of the text for him. There's definitely an ascetic, celibate ideology that he wants to get across here, and he does that through telling this story in a way that we don't find in the other texts.
So we have a rewriting and a direct quotation.
Exactly. So there's definitely rewriting going on here for other purposes. I think the same is true also in the case of the crossing the river, right? He adds this element, which I don't think was in the earlier text, but correct me if I'm wrong, of not wanting to see himself naked, right? As the reason.
That was in the first text.
First text.
There was something about,
Uh,
he was ashamed even to see himself naked. That's on the second
and that
page.
in the second
The
page.
first source on the second page in the middle.
Yes, yeah. That the theater to remain. No, but it's a different. But isn't a different logic there?
It's not on the same occasion, but the motif of
The-
shame that there is shame
right.
involved in nakedness.
Right. But there it's
Grace,
right.
But he put it in a different context.
That's right. Okay, so there seems to be some kind of discussion correspondence with the earlier texts, but obviously put to different uses and new elements added.
I think that it's the first time that we see it is said that.
Good.
Not just telling the story, but relating to some source telling that, and then the continuation.
Very good. And then again, he mentions that, right, as there were among them persons of eminent piety, distinguished for their story, who said and did many things worthy of being recorded. I deem it useful to interweave with my histories, meaning he's definitely aware of his language of citation and interaction with other traditions about this individual. And perhaps most importantly, because it's a historiographical text, he's embedding this within his overarching narrative of the foundation of monasteries and how the ascetic movement spread. Yeah.
Okay, a nice interesting aspect is also that Socrates is really living in a bookish culture, because it's not only that he's quoting Athanasius, but he's also reading from a book where the letter to the Corinthians is
Good.
is written.
Right. He says he's reading from it, but he didn't just
Bookish
quote.
culture where books are everywhere on your next to your bed when you
Beautiful.
get married, and you're reading it to people, and that's actually a kind of
Very nice. Meaning it's not that he just quotes from the book, from the text. He takes the book and reads from it.
that's actually mirrored in the
Mirrored it. Good.
literal quotation or summary of Athanasius.
Very nice.
Or is it vice versa, that he's attributing this bookish culture to this couple?
I think that's what you're saying, Raymond, right? That even if it's not necessarily Amun himself.
I mean, both could be true. I mean, because Socrates was living in a bookish culture, he was. Just
Oh, I thought that's what you were saying.
to-
Okay.
To the historical situation, and the bookish culture would explain the way how he's actually composing or combining different sources.
Exactly. Did you want to add? No, did you want to add something? Okay. 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 So now we'll. Any other comment? No. Okay. Now we'll skip to again. We'll skip Sazaman and we'll move to Abba Isaiah. So writing around the same time as Socrates in Gaza, and who would like to read this, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Abba Amun told me, I said to the elder Abba Poemen, who are these?
Abba Amun is our Amun, and Poemen is another early, like 4th century, very famous, appears in a lot of these texts, Egyptian ascetic monk.
If I go to the cell of a brother, or the brother comes to me for something, we fear to speak to one another, lest a foreign word be said between us. And the elder replied, you do well, since youth requires vigilance. And I said to him, how then do the elders speak? And he replied, the elders have passed beyond vigilance, and there is found among them nothing foreign to say. And I said to him, if it is necessary that I speak with the brother, should I discuss scriptures with him, or the words of elders? And the elder said to him, if you cannot
Said to me. Yeah.
said to me,
Mhm.
and if you cannot part in silence, it will help you to speak words of the fathers rather than those of the scriptures. For there's danger in your speaking of the scriptures. I said to Abba Peter, who is with Abba Lot? Who is with Abba Lot? What should I do? When I'm in solitary silence, my heart is at peace. But if a brother comes to me, he says to me words of the
those outside, and it troubles my heart. Abba Lot responded and said, my key opens your door. And I asked him, what is this word? And the elder said, if the brother comes to you, you say to him, what's new? Or where do you come from? Or how are the brothers? Did they receive you or not? Then you open your brother's door and you hear things you do not wish to. And I said to him, what then should I do, my father, if your brother comes to me? And the elder said, complete mourning is teaching, but there is no contrition.
But where there is no.
But where there is no contrition, there cannot be vigilance. And I said to him, if I'm in the cell, contrition is with me. But if someone comes to me, or when I go out for something, I no longer find it in me. And the elder replied, saying, it is because it has not yet submitted to you, rather you have borrowed it. For it is written in Deuteronomy, if your Hebrew brother is sold to you, he shall serve you for 6 years, and on the 7th year you shall set him free. Yet if you should give him a wife, and he should have children in your house, and he should not wish to leave because of his wife and children, take an awl and pierce his ear at the door, and he shall be a servant to you forever. And I asked him, what is this word? And he said, if a person makes an effort at something, whether he needs it, whenever he needs it, he will find it in the things he wishes. And I said to him, our Father, do me a favor and tell me a word. And he said to me, if someone adopts people as his children, they will not stay with him. But if he begets them, it is impossible for them to flee and leave him.
Okay, so this is our presentation of Amun in Abba Isaiah, in this text. Where is Amun here? Exactly. This whole narrative, everything we just read, is related by Amun himself. Right? He's the storyteller, telling it to Abba Isaiah, presumably. Then within the text, the storytelling continues. Right? Kind of conversations within conversations within conversations. In that way, very reminiscent of Platonic dialogues. How is Abba Amun characterized here? And does it correspond at all to the earlier texts we've been reading? It doesn't really seem like there's any connection, right? What?
He's the seeker. He's not the model.
Good. He's not the model. He's the seeker. Good. Yeah. He's seeking. There is actual teaching involved in what he receives, right? Which arguably we do have his teaching with his wife. There is some content going on there, but a lot of what Amun's character was about in the other texts was about the miracles associated with him, right? His holiness associated with his actions or clairvoyance that other people had around him. Here, he is the seeker of wisdom and the receiver of wisdom from other fathers, primarily concerned with what question? What's the main concern here? What's the main issue on the table? Exactly. Whether and how to produce meaning, to produce content. To talk or not to talk, and if you're going to talk, what are you going to talk about? Right? What is it safe to talk about? What is it not safe to talk about? That's what they're talking about. Okay, so there's a lot of self-reference going on in this text, the kind of layers within layers. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. So if this text is appearing after all the other texts, and if people have some kind of awareness of the other texts, it's a striking presentation of this Amun who seems in no relation to the other texts. Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's the original for foreign word?
That I do remember. It's Melta Nuchroyo.
Is it necessarily word?
Again, that, by the way, that's not, it's a Syriac translation of a Greek original, but yeah.
What
Yeah.
I'm thinking, davar zar, davar acher. I mean,
Yes.
it can be
For
a
sure.
euphemism
Definitely.
for exactly the sexual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that I debated it when I translated it, as one always has in English. Do you do word or thing? Exactly for that reason. It's not clear that we're talking about, not entirely clear that we're talking about verbal words, but I chose that because ultimately it seems that most of the text is talking about talking. But you're right. It could have been thing.
That disappears with age.
Yeah, good. Very, very important point. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so our last text, Apophthegmata Patrum, maybe the most famous text associated, or maybe nowadays, associated with the monastic movement. Guy, would you like to be our anonymous voice?
Abba Muno Nitria came to see Abba Anthony and said to him, "Since my rule is stricter than yours, how is it that your name is better known among men than mine is?"
Great question.
Abba Anthony answered, "It is because I love God more than you." It was said of Abba Amun that a very small quantity of wheat every 2 months was sufficient for him. Now he went to find Abba Poimen and said to him, "When I go to my neighbor's cell, or when he comes to mine for some need or other, we're afraid of entering into conversation for fear of slipping into worldly subjects." The old man replied, "You're right, for young men need to be watchful." Then Abba Amun continued, "But the old men, what do they do?" He replied, "The old men who have advanced in virtue have nothing in them that is worldly. There is nothing worldly in their mouths of which they could speak. But," Amun replied, "when I am obliged to speak to my neighbor, do you prefer me to speak of the scriptures or of the saying of the fathers?" The old man answered him, "If you can't be silent, you'd better talk about the saying of the fathers than about scriptures. It is not so dangerous." A brother came to Sketis to see Abba Amun and said to him, "My father is sending me out on an errand, but I am afraid of fornication." The old man answered, "Whatever the hour when the temptation comes upon you, say, 'God of all virtue, by the prayers of my father, save me from it.'" So, one day, when a young girl closed the door upon him, he began to cry out with all his might, "God of my father, save me!" And immediately he found himself on the road to Sketis.
Thoughts? This is all we have in the Apophthegmata Patrum. In general, all the texts I'm giving you are the complete text because I think the complete story is is important. How does this seem to be relating to the other texts we've been reading? What? It's related to Abba Isaiah. In what ways?
Same topic comes up. There's a problem about speaking.
Problem about speaking.
And also the notion that in old age it's less dangerous to speak.
And also teachers and all elders
and younger disciples. Yep.
There is a more the implicated
Laid out.
later as fornication.
Yeah.
And also the personae of the previous stories all appear here. There's Antony, there's Proem,
Yeah.
and Pomen, and
Anyone, exactly. So we have the Anthony from the individualistic stories, right? From what I'm calling the individualistic mode. We have the Anthony from the life of Anthony and from all the other texts that we read that doesn't appear in Abba and Zeh. Yeah.
But it throws out the quotation from Deuteronomy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's yeah. There's a lot less of that description and that exegetical move, which, by the way, is ironic when you think about it, because it's based on scripture, which we were just told was dangerous. Yeah.
I find it interesting that there's actually one difference which sets apart Athanasius from all the other texts which we have, which is actually that all the other texts seem to miss the pointer of the story of Athanasius, because actually both parts of the story in Athanasius are speaking about overcoming distance, geographical distance in the case of Anthony and Abamun, and also the distance crossing the river. And the crucial point is that in the case of Anthony and Abamun is that they did not meet physically. And all the other texts, actually, from the history of the monks onwards, always need to create a situation of a chavruta, of monks who are meeting and are discussing and learning and teaching things together. And it's interesting that this interesting idea, which was apparently important to Athanasius, that these two persons who were in totally different places nevertheless created some kind of contact between them, was totally missed by all the other texts.
Brilliant. So basically, what you're saying is maybe there's something about the dialogical nature of monastic, of later ascetic coexistence that is kind of mirrored in the actual collective nature of the texts.
That happens from the second text onward.
From the second text onward, as opposed to Anthony, who's really trying to stress not only with Amun, I mean that is definitely paralleled in many other parts of that text, where he's really trying to stress the individualistic and completely anchoretic existence of the ascetics. Very interesting. Which one? What?
The last one.
Okay.
Gives the feeling of a more layered text, in which first we have stories about Abraham, and then someone puts them together in a mode that keeps them separate. We have one story, then another story, then a third story, and this feeling with an editor who is still limited not to manipulate the text, but have the mandate only to present
One after the other in succession, but not creating a chain, kind of very much different from Abba Isaiah, it's stories within stories within stories, but also different from all the other texts we saw. That's a very, very valuable point. So what is all this? Yeah.
there is the ranking. Who is better than King and White, which appears only here.
Only in the last story. Nice. Yeah, which might go with that point of, what's your name, by the way? Omil. Yeah, we might go with Omil's point of, interesting.
Another thing about the ranking, is part of it, is the elder versus the youth. The elder has achieved certain state, but unless I'm mistaken, in this last short passage, we see Abba Amun as the youth, and then we see him as the elder. Is that correct? The last passage he becomes, he's suddenly the elder.
No, because it doesn't speak about the love of God. It's still like purpose.
To see Abba Amun and said to my father. I mean, he definitely is presented in the higher part of the hierarchy. Yeah.
The old man replied, who is the old man?
Yeah, and it's just a brother who comes to him yeah.
brother whose father told him to do. Now Abu Amun is giving him the advice. He comes.
Excellent. So he's progressed. What's changing over the text is him. He's getting older. Yeah, he's progressed in terms of his own hierarchy or his place within the hierarchy. That's very helpful.
It's very interesting that Abba Amun, the old man who is supporting the view that the elders, the sheikhs, are those who remain silent and so on, who are very strict in their halakha, and so nonetheless doesn't love God well enough, and he's not the best.
At least according to
all
Anthony.
His ascesis is not as good as Anthony.
Anthony's, yeah. Yep. I know that's a very interesting, definitely an interesting apophthegm. Katya, did you want to add something before?
I was thinking, so all texts obviously include certain like ethical judgments.
Ethical judgments, yeah.
Or like ethical norms that they want to kind of bring to the forefront. And I think the first one struck me as a kind of role model narrative, because it has so many positive attributes of like Anthony's life. Like, and what that has brought to others, like joy, and it's related to like his individual kind of way of life, I guess, or to the soul that ascended to heaven. Whereas in the second text that we read, in his alone, what you get at the beginning is like, first of all, his social value. You get like the status of the person in society, which is like a complete shift. In the first historiographical text that we read, we come back to kind of being devout, so a kind of ethical purity with regard to the soul. Before we don't know if it's an ethical or an intellectual purity, I don't know. But here we have it framed within a kind of thematic context of monasteries of Egypt, rather than a single story.
Wait, here being, which one?
The Socrates.
Ah, oh, right.
And then the last two ones, the collective models, they seem to be kind of warning of pitfalls more than role model texts, I find.
Dangers, right. Uh-huh. That's interesting.
But that's just like observations.
No, that's what I'm asking for. So basically, maybe to connect to a point that Ryman made earlier, before we started reading the text, that you're saying maybe there's something about what I'm calling the last two collective model texts that is kind of emerging from within the society that it's talking about. And therefore, it can already talk about the dangers, the problems, the pitfalls, the challenges, let's say. So I see we don't have that much longer, and I want to make sure I see if you have any thoughts. I mean, I know I was encouraging kind of a comparison just at any level between these texts, but I want to ask, in addition, if you have any thoughts about this question of individualistic versus collective models, if there's anything about the rhetoric, the content that changes between columns 1 through 5 and columns 6 and 7. I know that it's hard to answer the question because it, to some degree, is comparing apples and oranges. They're talking about different things, mostly, even though there are some points of contact. But that in and of itself is, I think, important to note. Is there any meaning in terms of the effect the text has on you as a reader, in terms of how you would think to go about understanding it historically, rhetorically? Any thoughts about that are welcome. Or is this just not relevant? Is this Yeah.
Just really a beginning comment. It seems that if you have a text, like apparently Athanasius was the first that really talked about society type of life. The first text is really what one could call anthrocentric, and so far as it focuses on Anthony. And even though it talks about Amun,
Yeah.
the very end of it, it said, when we learn from this, we learn about the purity of Anthony's
Completely.
soul.
Completely.
So it may have something to do with it focusing on a biography and on a single person, that it always goes back to that person. Whether you can get the same sort of message, as Kat pointed out, there seems to be at least these short passages of different emphases in mind or direction that in one way or another Abamun appears in.
Mm-hmm.
So it may be that that's one way to separate out a biography from other texts.
The biographical focus of the first text. Thank you. Other thoughts? Yeah.
What strikes me most is the modular way the texts are developed. As in folklore literature, you have topoi and you have formulas, and then as I suppose as the years pass, the elements from one story, I assume that you can find elements from the story of Amun in other stories from in the same collection, so you have the modular construction of the whole literature.
And in this, you're saying there wouldn't be a real difference between columns 1 through 5 and columns 6 and 7. They're just all kind of building on each other to some degree, taking and leaving the different modules as we proceed.
I'm not saying that there's no difference, I'm just saying that the way
That's
of construction of the text
Good. Yeah, thank you.
builds
On the
these
modular
elements
progression.
from
Yep.
earlier.
Thank you. Do people think, this is kind of, Guy predicted earlier that orality might be a recurrent theme? Do you think this has anything to do with the difference we're seeing? Or the
The model is folklore literature, then yes. You have the elements that are easily remembered. Stasis, floating, transportation,
Right.
and
they get transported. But in terms of the last two texts, these collective model texts, is there something about orality that might be more conducive to this kind of way of composing texts? Can we postulate that maybe initially there's more of an oral background to these texts or not? I don't know. Yeah, Katya.
Would the passing of time also make a difference, maybe? Because the sense I get from this Athanasius text is like, almost it's like an idealization of an aesthetic life, where it's kind of described in the most beautiful way possible. Like, this is how you should live, this is fantastic. Whereas what you get at the end is like, almost a kind of, I wouldn't say ritualized, but it's like, okay, so now we've done this for at least 100 years. What's happened here is like, oh, well, we're still human, too bad.
But wouldn't you expect, I mean, I would think you might expect the opposite. Wouldn't you expect the idealized form to come, the idealized, and in Athanasius' text, it's so crafted in a way. To me, it seems that might be surprising that that's the earliest text. There's something maybe a little, at least apparently, kind of rough around the edges with at least the last text, I'd say. Maybe not, I don't know.
Precisely. The first one, Athanasius, has a plot from beginning to end. The others are made of elements, modular elements that you combine together, which is what happens with our literature.
I see. So you're saying, okay, so that you're saying you do think that the final texts possibly reflect more of an oral setting than the earlier texts? Is that what you're suggesting? Okay, thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, and just a general thought about genre, because we're
Of course, that's what we're here for, yeah.
And so, the most extreme critique of genre studies, of course, came from Derrida, right? And he drives me crazy and annoys me for all sorts of reasons. But here he makes an interesting point, which is that whenever we try to pinpoint a genre, the genre seems to slip out from under us, right? That is, as soon as you say, what is a novel, or what is a qasida in Arabic literature? Once you start to write down the definitions of it, you see that no two texts really fit. Well, only one text will ultimately fit a given genre perfectly. And so, I don't know. I mean, just generating some thought around that question. I mean, I use the word genre in my talk later also. I think that it does have meaning. I think that texts relate to each other in certain variable ways, but still allowed to speak about something central. But there's the push in the opposite direction also.
Yeah, no, so excellent. So that's basically the question that I'm asking. Is it helpful to redescribe these texts as operating within different genres when I'm defining the term as individualized genre versus collective genre? To put the question, kind of what I'm asking the last hour and a half is basically that. Does this make a difference? Does it mean anything to say that Abba Isaiah sits down and writes a text that's collective? That choice that he makes, which Sazeman and Socrates 10 years before him didn't make. That's exactly, and I totally agree with that kind of challenge of this problem of how every text changes whatever genre you try to put within it. Right?
First of all, I really enjoyed how we're actually collecting here material for a collectively authored text.
Exactly. That's the point, yeah.
But the question I have is actually brings us back to your initial question, and I didn't really understand in which direction you go in that respect. I mean, what we actually here have are examples of text from different literary genres. I mean, ecclesiastical history is something different from a collective of Degmata and of a biography of a saint. And what you are actually arguing, and that's actually an interesting question, to which extent and how we can check a historical hypothesis, namely that there was a transition from individual authorship to collective authorship, whether it's possible to apply such a general thesis to different literary genres. I mean, that's actually what you are arguing, if I understand you correctly. And I still
just to clarify, just the transition that's not absolute, meaning the possibility becomes, it's not that they stop writing individualized texts. Yeah.
But having this text and this text in front of me,
Mm-hmm.
I still do not really
Mm-hmm.
have clear feeling whether when we, for example, are speaking about the integration of a literary text into an ecclesiastical history, we really have the right to say this is the same literary phenomenon like the repetition of certain traditions in the collection of Degmata.
What I said about Eusebius, or applying it to Socrates?
Both.
So
the question is really that there actually are two interlacing theories. I mean, on the one hand, the genres and the trans-genre hypothesis, which you apply to these different genres, although actually each of those genres has its own development and its own laws and its own structure, and that's actually the point which I still do not really understand, whether it's really scientifically sound to do this step.
to do the step of the crossing of them, or
Of mixing up, I mean, actually keeping the differentiation between different literary genres, because again, an ecclesiastical history is something totally different and has a different audience and have a different attitude from the author side than the collection of Degmata. And your historical hypothesis is very interesting, and it's of course even more interesting interesting if you, what Marin said, that it might be connected to rabbinic literature and everything. But how can we do this this analytical step in a sound way to apply such a broad hypothesis to different genres and say it's still the same
Move.
historical,
Yeah, that's.
the same mood, the same process.
Yeah.
That's actually the thing which I still do not really understand.
I would say it's that you don't understand or you're not sure
I'm not
it's
sure that we are
valid.
allowed
Yeah.
to do that.
So yeah. So I agree. That's part of what I'm working with. It feels like, as I said, it's a pattern that I notice, but is it just in my eyes, right? Is it not really there? Is it even sound, like you're saying, to say that there is a common denominator between these radically different types of text?
Also, if there are changes within the different genres, do they change in the same manner? If they change from individual to collective manner of parting, do the effects are the same effects, or we're speaking of different phenomena within this composition?
Excellent. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to figure out. And if we had time to look at another example, then we'd ask that question too. But these are the issues I'm trying to work through and coping with.
I mean,
When I was a child, there was a program on French TV, Les 5 dernières minutes, the last 5 minutes. And you,
Of the world.
No. You had to solve, I mean, who done it? Who killed?
I see where you're
who is the
going, Guy.
murderer?
I see where you're going with this.
And we don't have any. We don't have even 5 minutes now. But I want to come back to your introduction about the genres of patrologies in the mid-19th century. You said you have a guess of where exactly it started. I'm curious to hear your guess, but what I'm even more curious to go back to a question that was proposed to you. Why do these three special genres of Palestinian patristic literature happen in Palestine? Someone suggested maybe because of the Jews, and you said maybe, and then no one mentioned the Jews anymore during these 90 minutes. And no one mentioned the pagans. As you know, the Athanasius' Life of Antony appears fully as a text, as a genre, fully organized, ex nihilo almost. And a lot of scholarly literature has been written in the last 100 years, since Reitzenstein, looking for pagan origins of these texts, or parallels. This has not been mentioned, and neither the pagans nor the Jews have been mentioned here, and I think that it may be a good idea to look aside, to break away from these patrological straitjackets organized by usually Catholic theologians, and this is not the game we should be playing.
So that's why I said that I think that's exactly the mistake. I think those patrological genres are not the route we should be going down, and that I think it distracts us from what I think might be other possible ways to cut the cake. But I do hear that there's also some problematics with what I'm proposing. So yes, nobody in patrologies talks about individualistic versus collective. I'm saying maybe this is a different way to look at how to classify texts. To get to your question of Palestine and Jews and pagans, so yes, this might seem very reminiscent of rabbinic texts, which have both models within the collective. I mean, they're as a rule, they're collective, but you have collective with a strong editorial hand and collective that's an anthology that just puts it out, right? You have both of those models within the collective model, and that seems like an interesting parallel.
There is an article has just come out by Catherine Heshen on the
Yes.
Apophthegma and the
I know, yeah.
Jerusalem Talmud.
Yeah.
So it's kind of general, but at least I think she also, if I remember correctly, she also addresses the question of orality, and I think she says that there are
She
kind
works a
of
lot on that
yeah,
now.
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, I have seen that article, and that's an example of somebody kind of focusing on this one case where we see the parallel.
Yeah.
And what I'm asking is there a way to zoom out and see it happening in several different cases? But thank you very, very much for your
But who
comments.
was at the origin of this?
Come to Maran's conference in a couple weeks, and you'll hear whether your guess about Catholic theologians was correct or not.
So we
That's
we
great.
have
Yes, I'm told that you have to go to lunch now. Is it in the Ivrit?
lunch is
restaurant?
at the Ivrit. Some of you know where it is. Those who don't, please
Follow
follow